Hello, I'm Essay, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
In the austere intellectual landscape of 12th century Europe, a profound question animated the cloisters of the burgeoning Cistercian order. It was a problem of immense spiritual and philosophical weight concerning the very engine of human salvation. How could a soul, burdened by its inherited imperfections, actively turn towards its Creator? What was the precise role of human volition in the universe governed by an omnipotent and freely given divine grace? This was the central challenge that captivated the mind of Baldwin of Ford, an English scholar and monk whose intellectual journey would produce one of the era's most sophisticated explorations of the human will as an instrument of divine knowledge. His early work represents a formidable attempt to chart the internal mechanics of faith, framing a rigorous system around the soul's ascent to God. Baldwin's response to this dilemma was to formulate what can be understood as a volitional theology. He posited that the human will, or volitions, when disciplined and correctly oriented, becomes the primary faculty for apprehending spiritual truth. This perspective diverged sharply from the methods gaining prominence in the urban schools, particularly those championed by figures like Peter Abelard, whose approach elevated dialectical reason as the supreme tool of theological inquiry. For Baldwin and his Cistercian brethren, the path to understanding was paved with affective experience. The intellect followed where the sanctified will led. This framework proposed that the rigorous asceticism of monastic life, the constant prayer, and the cultivation of humility were components of a cognitive training regimen. Their purpose was to purify the will, freeing it from the distractions of the flesh and the ego, thereby making it a receptive vessel for divine illumination. The methodology underpinning this volitional framework was a form of effective exegesis. Baldwin approached sacred scripture as a living text whose deepest meanings were accessible through the lens of spiritual transformation. The words of the page were a mirror reflecting the reader's own interior state. The key to unlocking this deeper reality was caritas, a concept denoting a selfless, divine love. In Baldwin's thought, caritas functioned as a powerful cognitive tool. It was a spiritual sense that allowed the soul to perceive the presence of God where pure reason might find only allegory or historical narrative. His early treatise, the Tractatus de caritate, provides the foundational architecture for this idea. In it, he meticulously outlines how the cultivation of love for God and neighbor rewards the soul's priorities and clarifies its perception, enabling it to move from a state of spiritual blindness to one of profound insight. This interpretive method finds its most compelling application in Baldwin's treatment of the Song of Songs. While many commentators of his day interpreted this deeply poetic biblical book as an allegory for the relationship between Christ and the Church, Baldwin advanced a more intimate reading. He saw it as a detailed map of the individual soul's loving ascent to its divine spouse. Each verse became a milestone in a personal spiritual drama, depicting the soul's yearnings, its moments of doubt, its experience of divine absence, and its ultimate ecstatic union with God. Through this lens, the passions described in the text were transformed from earthly desires into powerful metaphors for the will's intense longing for the divine. The soul learns, through a cycle of seeking and finding, to love more purely, and in doing so, to know more deeply. This interpretation made the Song of Songs a practical manual for the contemplative life, a guide for any monk seeking to understand the stages of his own spiritual journey. Baldwin's intellectual project was deeply indebted to the towering figure of his order, Bernard of Clairvaux. He was Bernard's direct intellectual heir, tasked with the monumental effort of giving systematic form to his predecessor's powerful mystical insights. Bernard's sermons on grace and on the Song of Songs were passionate, poetic, and profoundly influential, delivered with an oratorical fire that moved hearts across Europe. Baldwin took this rich, experiential source material and subjected it to a more structured, analytical examination. He sought to build a coherent theological and psychological system from Bernard's affective foundations. Where Bernard provided the spark of mystical genius, Baldwin constructed the intricate intellectual machinery, creating a pre-scholastic framework that explained how the love Bernard preached could function as a reliable pathway to truth. This Cistercian intellectual tradition, with its emphasis on the will and affective experience, established a powerful alternative to the nascent scholasticism of the universities. The schools of Paris were increasingly arenas for logical disputation, where theological propositions were tested with the sharp tools of Aristotelian dialectic. Baldwin's work, forged in the contemplative silence of the Ford Abbey, represented a different kind of intellectual rigor. It was a science of the interior world, one whose proofs were found in the transformed life and the sanctified will. This approach shaped the intellectual formation of subsequent generations of English Cistercians, ensuring the continuation of a distinct spiritual and philosophical lineage. Figures like Stephen of Sawley, writing a generation later, would carry forward this focus on the soul's affective journey, demonstrating the enduring influence of Baldwin's foundational synthesis of love and knowledge. His early work, therefore, established the essential grammar of his thought, a grammar centered on the will's capacity for divine encounter. Yet this exploration of the soul's interior ascent naturally led to a more concrete and universally pressing theological question. If the believer's internal disposition was paramount, how did this interior reality connect with the external, communal rites of the Church? Specifically, how did the central act of Christian worship, the Eucharist, function as a conduit for the grace Baldwin had so meticulously described? This question, concerning the very nature of sacramental reality, would demand a new and even more ambitious intellectual synthesis, culminating in his magnum opus, the Sacramento altaris. It was here that Baldwin would apply his understanding of the soul to resolve one of the most contentious theological debates of his age. His early work, therefore, established the essential grammar of his thought, a grammar centered on the will's capacity for divine encounter. Yet this exploration of the soul's interior ascent naturally led to a more concrete and universally pressing theological question. If the believer's internal disposition was paramount, how did this interior reality connect with the external, communal rites of the Church? Specifically, how did the central act of Christian worship, the Eucharist, function as a conduit for the grace Baldwin had so meticulously described? This question, concerning the very nature of sacramental reality, would demand a new and even more ambitious intellectual synthesis, culminating in his magnum opus, the Sacramento altaris. It was here that Baldwin would apply his understanding of the soul to resolve one of the most contentious theological debates of his age. The intellectual environment Baldwin entered was still echoing with the aftershocks of the Berengarian controversy. A century earlier, Berenger of Tours had applied the tools of dialectic to the Eucharist with what many considered a devastating rationalism. He questioned how the substance of bread and wine could truly become the body and blood of Christ, while all their sensible properties, their appearance, taste, and texture remained unchanged. His challenge forced theologians to articulate a defense of the real presence. The initial response, spearheaded by Lanfranc of Bec, was forceful and assertive, affirming the miraculous change. It was, however, philosophically underdeveloped, lacking a precise vocabulary to explain the mechanics of the transformation. The core dilemma persisted, a profound intellectual impasse. How could the mind reconcile the testimony of the senses with the declaration of faith? The sophisticated Aristotelian framework of substance and accident, which would later provide Thomas Aquinas with a powerful explanatory model, was unavailable to the thinkers of the 12th century. They had to forge their own tools from the resources at hand, primarily the scriptures and the writings of the Church Fathers. Into this fraught intellectual space, Baldwin brought his magnum opus, De Sacramento Altaris, or On the Sacrament of the Altar. This work stands as a monumental achievement of monastic theology, a comprehensive and deeply nuanced exploration crafted within the intellectual world of the cloister. Before the ascendancy of the university schools, Baldwin's method was one of profound synthesis. He drew deeply from the sacramental theology of Ambrose of Milan and the antheretical arguments of Augustine of Hippo, weaving their insights together with the characteristic Cistercian emphasis on affective piety and the interior experience of the believer. He effectively reoriented the entire debate. He shifted the focus from a purely objective, metaphysical puzzle about the elements on the altar toward a more holistic view that encompassed the transformation within the communicant. His approach was phenomenological for its time, examining the sacrament as a lived reality whose truth is apprehended through its effects on the faithful soul. Within the opening book of De Sacramento Altaris, Baldwin meticulously lays out the architecture of his solution. He develops a precise, dualistic terminology to navigate the mystery. He distinguishes between the sacramentum tandem, meaning the sacrament alone, which refers to the outward, visible species of bread and wine, the reality perceived by the physical senses. This he contrasts with the res sacramenti, the thing or reality of the sacrament, which is the grace conferred, and the true spiritual substance of Christ's body and blood. His critical innovation was to bind these two realities together through the act of faith. For Baldwin, the sacrament operates on two correlated levels. A real objective change occurs in the elements, a truth guaranteed by divine power. Simultaneously, a corresponding subjective change occurs within the worthy recipient. He argued that faith itself functions as a kind of spiritual sense, an organ of perception capable of apprehending the res sacramenti that lies beyond the grasp of physical sight, smell, or taste. The physical senses perform their proper function. They report the accidents of bread and wine. Faith, however, performs a higher function. It perceives the true substance hidden beneath these outward forms. This formulation elegantly sidestepped the Berengarian dilemma. The senses are deceived in a way. They are simply reporting on the level of reality to which they have access. True perception of the event requires an instrument suited to the object, and for a spiritual reality, that instrument is faith formed by love. This linkage of objective change to subjective transformation was his masterstroke. The sacrament was a single, unified event in which the transubstantiation of the elements and the spiritual nourishment of the soul were two facets of the same divine action. The grace received, The res sacramenti was the ultimate proof and purpose of the change in the sacramentum tantum. This sophisticated framework placed Baldwin as a crucial transitional figure in the history of theology. His work represents the intellectual apex of the patristic and monastic tradition on the Eucharist, a full-flowering thought before the arrival of new philosophical tools. It was one of the most exhaustive treatments of the subject written prior to the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which would formally codify the doctrine of transubstantiation and make it a matter of dogmatic definition. Baldwin's careful reasoning and scriptural grounding provided a robust intellectual foundation that helped stabilize the doctrine for his generation. His work shows a clear intellectual debt to his predecessors, building upon the foundations laid by Paschasius Rabidus in the 9th century, while providing a more systematic response to the specific logical challenges raised by Berengar. When compared to the later scholastic synthesis of Thomas Aquinas, the distinctiveness of Baldwin's Cistercian approach becomes even clearer. Aquinas, armed with a mature Aristotelian vocabulary, would explain the change as a conversion of the entire substance of the bread and wine into the substance of the body and blood of Christ, while the accidents, the properties like color and taste, subsist without a subject. Aquinas' explanation is a model of metaphysical precision. Baldwin's explanation, while reaching the same doctrinal conclusion, travels a different path. His argument is less a detached philosophical proof and more a holistic theology of participation. It is rooted in the dynamics of faith, love, and spiritual perception. For Baldwin, the truth of the sacrament is ultimately confirmed and understood in the soul's loving encounter with the divine, an experience that validates the metaphysical miracle. His work is a testament to an intellectual world where theological inquiry was inseparable from the quest for spiritual transformation. Having thus anchored the central right of the Church in the believer's interior life, establishing faith as the very instrument of proceeding sacramental truth, Baldwin was logically compelled to examine the nature of faith itself. If faith was this powerful cognitive faculty, this spiritual sense capable of apprehending ultimate reality, then what was its precise character? How did it relate to the other faculties of the soul, like reason and the will? This inquiry would lead him to his other great treatise, a profound exploration of the epistemology of belief. He would turn his analytical mind from the object of faith to the act of faith, seeking to chart its origins, its structure, and its ultimate purpose in the soul's journey toward God. Having thus anchored the central right of the Church in the believer's interior life, establishing faith as the very instrument of proceeding sacramental truth, Baldwin was logically compelled to examine the nature of faith itself. If faith was this powerful cognitive faculty, this spiritual sense capable of apprehending ultimate reality, then what was its precise character? How did it relate to the other faculties of the soul, like reason and the will? This inquiry would lead him to his other great treatise, a profound exploration of the epistemology of belief. He would turn his analytical mind from the object of faith to the act of faith, seeking to chart its origins, its structure, and its ultimate purpose in the soul's journey toward God. This new work, titled The Commendation Fidei, or On the Commendation of Faith, entered a vibrant and contentious 12th century dialogue concerning the relationship between belief and rationality. The intellectual air was thick with the legacy of Anselm of Canterbury, whose monumental proposition of fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding, had set the terms of the debate for generations. Anselm's program was one of profound confidence in the power of reason to plumb the depths of revealed truth, to find logical necessity in the articles of the creed. For many, this represented the apex of scholastic endeavor. Yet for Baldwin, a Cistercian steeped in a tradition that prized experience and affective devotion, this intellectualist formulation, while brilliant, was incomplete. It described the mind's journey, yet it seemed to omit the heart's transformation. Baldwin's response was to develop a more holistic epistemology, one that integrated the will and the affections directly into the act of knowing. His central contribution into Commendation Fidei is the careful delineation of two distinct types of faith. He introduces a critical taxonomy, distinguishing between what he terms fides informis, or unformed faith, and fides formorter, faith formed by love. Fides informis represents a mere intellectual assent to a set of propositions. It is the cold acceptance of doctrine, the belief that certain things are true. For Baldwin, this was a necessary preliminary stage, a skeletal framework. It was, however, a faith devoid of life, a sterile conviction that could coexist with the soul's deep alienation from God. It was the faith of the scholar who could brilliantly defend the Trinity in a disputation, while his own soul remained untouched. The true goal, the very substance of a living relationship with the divine, was fides formorter. This was faith animated, shaped, and given its essential character by curators, the selfless, divine love that is a gift of grace. Faith formed by love becomes a new kind of perception, a cognition of the heart. It is an organ of spiritual sight that allows the believer to apprehend truths that are opaque to reason alone. This form of faith moves beyond the simple acceptance of dogma and becomes an active, loving trust, a complete orientation of the self toward the divine. It is this faculty that allows the believer to perceive the real presence in the Eucharist and to understand the deeper meaning of Scripture. To illustrate this powerful concept, Baldwin employs his characteristic method of allegorical exegesis, turning to the biblical account of Abraham and Isaac in the hands of a lesser thinker. This story is a test of obedience. For Baldwin, it becomes a profound epistemological parable from the perspective of worldly reason. God's command to Abraham is monstrous and illogical. It violates natural law, paternal love, and rational ethics. An intellect operating alone would be paralyzed or would reject the command as absurd. Abraham's response, however, flows from fides formator. His faith, forged through a lifetime of loving communion with God, grants him access to a higher logic. He is able to perceive the goodness of the command giver even when the command itself is incomprehensible. His willingness to proceed is an act of supreme cognitive trust, a form of knowing rooted in love that transcends the limitations of his own understanding. The sacrifice is an act of the will so perfectly aligned with the divine that it constitutes a form of Gnostic insight, a knowledge born of union. This framework represents a subtle yet decisive reorientation of the Anselmian project, where Anselm proposed faith-seeking understanding. Baldwin's work charts a course for faith-seeking love. For Anselm, reason was the primary instrument for exploring the content of an initial faith commitment. The ultimate goal was a deeper intellectual grasp of what was believed. For Baldwin, the journey is different. The intellect and reason have a preparatory role, clearing away logical fallacies and preparing the mind for contemplation. The decisive movement, however, is an act of the will, an opening of the soul to the infusion of caritate. It is this love that transforms faith from a static belief into a dynamic, cognitive power. The ultimate illumination of the intellect is a consequence of this affective union. One comes to understand God most perfectly by first loving God completely. In developing this model, Baldwin also reveals his debt to the pedagogical theories of the Victorine school, particularly the work of Hugh of St. Victor. Hugh's didascalchion had famously structured all learning, from the mechanical arts to the liberal arts, as a ladder ascending toward the ultimate study of sacred Scripture. Baldwin implicitly accepts the structured approach to knowledge. He sees the value in rational inquiry and disciplined study as a foundation. However, he redefines the pinnacle of the ascent. For the Victorine tradition, the summit was a profound intellectual comprehension of divine revelation. For Baldwin the Cistercian, the entire intellectual edifice existed to cultivate the ground of the soul, making it fertile for the seed of divine love. The arts and sciences prepare the mind, but the heart achieves the final synthesis. The enduring influence of this affective epistemology is significant. Baldwin's articulation of fides formator provided a sophisticated theological architecture for the burgeoning movements of devotional piety that would characterize the later Middle Ages. His ideas can be seen as a vital precursor to the English mystical tradition that flourished a century and a half later. Writers like Richard Rolle and Walter Hilton, in their detailed explorations of the soul's loving ascent to God, are Baldwin's intellectual heirs. Their focus on the fire of love, the cloud of unknowing, and the knowledge that comes through affective experience echoes the Cistercian's core insight that the heart possesses its own reasons, its own powerful way of knowing. In the commendatione fidei, Baldwin of Ford crafted a masterful synthesis of monastic spirituality and scholastic inquiry. He constructed a theory of knowledge where love was the supreme heuristic, and the transformed heart was the ultimate organ of perception. It was a beautiful, internally coherent, and spiritually compelling vision of the human person's intellectual and affective journey toward the divine. This profound idealism, this belief in a reality perceived through ascetic love and contemplative withdrawal, defined Baldwin the theologian. The question remained how this deeply introspective framework would endure the collision with the raw, external pressures of governing one of the most powerful and worldly political offices in all of Christendom. In the commendatione fidei, Baldwin of Ford crafted a masterful synthesis of monastic spirituality and scholastic inquiry. He constructed a theory of knowledge where love was the supreme heuristic, and the transformed heart was the ultimate organ of perception. It was a beautiful, internally coherent, and spiritually compelling vision of the human person's intellectual and affective journey toward the divine. This profound idealism, this belief in a reality perceived through ascetic love and contemplative withdrawal, defined Baldwin the theologian. The question remained how this deeply introspective framework would endure the collision with the raw, external pressures of governing one of the most powerful and worldly political offices in all of Christendom. The collision came in 1185 with his elevation to the Archbishop of Canterbury. This appointment thrust the contemplative abbot into a role that was as much about feudal logic and high politics as it was about spiritual leadership. The See of Canterbury was a vast administrative machine, a web of landholdings, legal courts, and political obligations that extended across England and into the papal curia in Rome. The man who had written with such eloquence on the interior castle of the soul was now the master of a very real and very worldly kingdom of his own. At the heart of this domain lay a challenge that would consume his archiepiscopate, the cathedral chapter of Christ's Church, a proud and ancient community of Benedictine monks who viewed themselves as the guardians of Canterbury's legacy and, crucially, as the archbishops, electors, and council. From Baldwin's Cistercian perspective, the monks of Christ's Church represented a form of monasticism that had grown comfortable and worldly. He perceived their fierce defense of their corporate privileges and vast endowments as a spiritual failing, a departure from the apostolic poverty he held as an ideal. He saw a community mired in legal disputes and material concerns, a far cry from the disciplined, reformed life he had cultivated at Ford Abbey. His intellectual framework, which prized purity of intention and a withdrawal from worldly entanglement, offered him a clear, if radical, solution. If the existing foundation was compromised, one must create a new one. This led to the defining and ultimately disastrous project of his tenure, the attempt to establish a new collegiate church at Hackington, a short distance from Canterbury. The plan was audacious. He would build a magnificent new church dedicated to St. Stephen and the recently canonized Thomas Becket, and staff it with a chapter of secular canons. These canons would be learned men, loyal directly to him, forming a new administrative and spiritual heart for the archdiocese. In his mind, this was a necessary act of spiritual renewal. It was a Cistercian model of expansion writ large, an attempt to bypass a compromised institution by founding a purer, more vigorous alternative. He intended for this new foundation to become the true center of the see's intellectual and devotional life, and perhaps even to claim the right of archiepiscopal election, thereby breaking the Benedictine monks' ancient monopoly. The monks of Christ's Church saw the project in a completely different light. Their perspective, preserved for history with curious detail in the chronicles of their own Gervase of Canterbury, was one of existential threat. To them, Baldwin's plan was a direct assault on their ancient rights, their identity, and their very existence. They saw a scheme to divert the immense revenues and pilgrim traffic associated with the cult of St. Thomas away from the cathedral where he was martyred and buried. It was an attack on their property, their prestige, and their historical primacy. Gervase's writings portrayed Baldwin as wolf in shepherd's clothing, a tyrannical innovator seeking to subvert a sacred tradition for his own purposes. The monks responded with every weapon at their disposal. They launched a sophisticated legal and diplomatic counteroffensive, dispatching delegations to the papal court and initiating a propaganda campaign across Europe. The Hackington dispute rapidly escalated into one of the great legal battles of the 12th century. It became a cause célèbre that preoccupied the papal curia for years. Appeals and counter-appeals flew between Canterbury and Rome, and the fortunes of each side waxed and waned with the arrival of each new papal bull. Pope Urban Roman III, a man sympathetic to monastic privileges, initially sided with the monks. His successor, Gregory VIII, had a brief pontificate, but seemed to lean toward Baldwin. The struggle then continued under Clement III, who was subjected to immense political pressure from the English crown. Baldwin's entire strategy depended on the steadfast support of King Henry IV. The king, remembering his own bitter conflict with Thomas Becket, and the monks who championed him, initially favored Baldwin's plan as a useful tool for curbing the chapter's power. Henry's support, however, was purely pragmatic. He saw a political advantage, while Baldwin saw spiritual necessity. This divergence of motives proved fatal to the project. Baldwin, the idealist, found himself a player in a game whose rules were dictated by power politics, a field where he possessed little skill. The monks of Christ's Church, by contrast, were masters of this game, heading home their political and legal acumen over centuries of defending their interests. When Henry IV died in 1189, Baldwin lost his most powerful protector. The new king, Richard I, had a single, overriding priority of financing his participation in the Third Crusade. The Canterbury monks, with their vast wealth, were able to offer the king a substantial sum in exchange for his support. With his royal backing gone, Baldwin's position became untenable. The end came swiftly. After years of bitter conflict, enormous expenditure, and relentless legal maneuvering that had scandalized Christendom, Baldwin was forced into a humiliating capitulation. A papal command, now backed by the English king, ordered the complete cessation of the Hackington project. The half-constructed walls of his college, the physical embodiment of his Cistercian dream of renewal, were ordered to be torn down. The monks of Christ's Church had won a total victory. The idealist, who sought to impose a new order of spiritual purity to the creation of a new institution, was defeated by the immense inertia and resilience of the old one. This crushing failure demonstrated the profound limits of personal piety and theological conviction when confronted with the realities of entrenched institutional power. For Baldwin, the man who believed the world could be reformed by a purified heart, The experience left him with few remaining paths in England. His entire archiepiscopate had become a testament to the chasm between the contemplative life he understood and the active life he was unable to master, a dilemma that would find its final, tragic resolution on the distant shores of the Holy Land. The definitive papal command to dismantle the walls at Hackington represented more than a legal or political defeat. It was the complete demolition of a tangible dream. For Baldwin of Ford, the Archbishop, whose entire intellectual and spiritual life revolved around the Cistercian ideal of purification and renewal, this failure in England was absolute. His attempt to superimpose a new order of spiritual rigor upon the old structures of Canterbury had been repulsed by the very institution he was meant to lead. The experience left him with a profound sense of impasse, a conviction that the path of reform in his own land was closed. The chasm between the contemplative clarity he so masterfully articulated in his writings and the chaotic active life he struggled to command had become an unbridgeable gulf. It was in this moment of profound disillusionment that the call for the Third Crusade arrived, offering a final, desperate, and ultimately tragic stage for his ideals. The decision to take the cross and journey to the Holy Land was the ultimate escalation of his personal philosophy. Having failed to reform a single diocese, he would now attempt to aid in the restoration of the entire Christian world at its symbolic heart. He traveled with the vanguard of the English forces, an aged archbishop embarking on a grueling military campaign, a living embodiment of the union between spiritual and temporal struggle. He arrived at the siege of Acre in 1 a sprawling, chaotic, and disease-ridden encampment that was a microcosm of all the worldly vices he had spent his life condemning. The chronicles of the period, particularly the accounts of Roger of Howden and Richard of Devizes, paint a grim picture. They described a camp beset by political rivalries, rampant immorality, and profound suffering. For Baldwin, this was the world in its most unrefined and fallen state. The sight of it, according to Howden, broke his spirit. He reportedly prayed to be released from a world whose sinfulness he could neither abide nor mend. His final illness soon followed, and he died in the Crusader camp in November of 190. His last will, a final testament to his core principles, endowed a foundation to use his wealth to feed the poor soldiers, a small, tangible act to the creators that had been the theoretical foundation of his life's work. To evaluate Baldwin of Ford solely on the outcomes of his archiepiscopate is to miss the substance of his historical importance. His political career was a sequence of frustrating defeats. His true significance, however, lies in the intellectual system he constructed, a system that offers a unique window into the currents of 12th century thought. His legacy is best understood as the perfection of the Cistercian ideal, a philosophy one might term the scholasticism of the heart. This was an intellectual endeavor as rigorous and systematic as the Aristotelian scholasticism that would soon dominate European universities. Yet its axioms were entirely different. It sought to map the universe of faith using the coordinates of love, will, and spiritual transformation. The genesis of this system was in the affective theology of the Cistercian predecessor, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard had provided the raw, passionate material, the emphasis on the soul's loving assent to God. Baldwin took this fervent spirituality and subjected it to a methodical, almost forensic analysis. In his treatises, particularly his profound work on the Eucharist, de sacramento altaris, he applies a precise, structured logic to the most mystical of subjects. He dissects the nature of faith, the mechanics of grace, and the transformative power of communion with the detailed precision of a philosopher. Yet his entire analysis is built upon the Augustinian premise that understanding follows from a rightly ordered love. For Baldwin, cognition was an act of the heart as much as the mind. The intellect could only proceed as far as the will was purified. This was a science of the soul, complete with its own first principles and logical progressions. This intellectual framework places him as a crucial transitional figure. He stands between the monastic, experiential theology of the early 12th century and the university-based systematic theology of the 13th, where a figure like Thomas Aquinas would later erect a monumental synthesis of Christian doctrine and Aristotelian reason. Baldwin had already constructed an equally ambitious, though less enduring, synthesis of doctrine and Augustinian love. His work demonstrates that the path to the great intellectual constructions of the High Middle Ages was a varied one. The Aristotelian revolution was the dominant force, yet powerful alternative systems were being forged in parallel. Baldwin's system, rooted in the contemplative tradition of the monastery, was ultimately less suited to the dialectical sparring of the university classroom. Its laboratory was the individual soul, its proofs were found in spiritual experience, and its goal was the transformation of the person. Therefore, the story of Baldwin of Ford is the story of a magnificent and tragic collision. It is the tragedy of a Cistercian idealist operating in a world of raw power politics. His life illustrates the immense difficulty of translating a perfected internal state into effective external action. The very purity of his vision rendered him inflexible and unable to navigate the compromises inherent in temporal authority. The man who could so eloquently chart the soul's journey toward divine union was consistently outmaneuvered in ecclesiastical thought. Yet this perceived failure is also the key to his importance. His career and his writings provide one of history's clearest demonstrations of a particular intellectual and spiritual path. He remains the preeminent example of the Cistercian mind at its most systematic, a thinker who believed that the most profound truths of existence were accessible through the disciplined and rigorous cultivation of the human heart. The stone walls of his college at Hackington may have been torn down, but the intellectual architecture he built in his treatises remains a powerful monument to one of the 12th century's great intellectual quests.
We really appreciate you tuning into this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.